The World Bank in 2007, one where it published, indicated that a number of public assistance, technical assistance always coming from outside, has not been as effective as they had intended, and now moving more towards building local capacity for development. A number of donor organizations are also moving in that direction, where they also are talking about, if you are going to give you any funding, then you need an African partner. Right? There's that increasing awareness of that. And there also seem to be an increasing awareness also coming from the continent itself. We've had a number of African-led initiatives. We have the Agenda 2063, the African Bond that is coming up. But I believe it's about time we move beyond the rhetoric. Led means African taking greater ownership of their development, but with the support coming from others and world wishes who want to see Africa develop. So, as we think about perspectives, it's important to have ways to be able to work with those communities. And it's not about, we have this money, so we are bringing this here, and this is what we want to do with it. The question is, what do they want? Let's include them in envisioning the project. Let's include them in the planning of the project. Let's include them to have that kind of ownership. And it's important that we spell out our intentions right from the beginning. What are the expectations? What do you expect to get out of that? And what do you expect them to also get out of that? Let's have those intentions all clarified right from the onset so that everyone can be on the same page. And again, important to understand the cross-cultural implications, some of the implications. So, like I talked about, that you need to be careful that you do not undermine some of the key elements that hold that social fabrics together. Which takes me to the other point about building on Africa's strength. I think that development needs to build on the strength of those who are being developed. What is it that we are developing there? Personally, I don't believe that development is abandonment. Development does not mean that you abandon what you have and follow another one. But I believe that development is more or less an incremental improvement in one way of life. So I am a Ghanaian and I love fufu. And we spend a lot of time trying to pound fufu, right? Right? We spend a lot of time not Australians. For me, development is finding, using technology, borrowing technology to make it easier for me to get my food to eat. It does not mean that I need to abandon food to eat pizza. Right? And I think development also means taking a sense of pride in what we have. Look, I travel, you go to Kenya, and there are several other countries. And they tell you, oh, we have continental breakfast, or we have continental food. And then you go there and you have every food there but African food. Because it's not continental enough. Right? It's like for a long time we have lost that sense of pride in ourselves. We've lost that sense of anything that is African. Very much also love. Have great potential. It has great potential. But I also know that it can only remain a potential unless you and I are willing to roll down our sleeve, renew our minds, and start taking actions that will help transform the continent from a land of poverty to a land of prosperity. And I remember during our time when we were in school in Ghana, and we meet conferences like this, and we talk about all the things that these leaders are doing, and they are doing this, they are doing that. And now I look around, and it's my friends and my colleagues who are in those kind of positions. And we are still talking about the same things. So my challenge to you today is, I know in no time you're all going to be graduating, and you take your place in the commanding heights of the economy. 30 years from now, into your own career, if there is a group like this of Africans, young people who have met, would they be talking about the same issues that you and I are talking?
So, so Mikia people are mobile foragers. In 2007, census recorded less than 1,000 Mikia individuals in the forest, and they collect tubers and honey and wild berries, while also hunting small games such as lemurs and warthogs and birds as well. So they also opportunistically practice slash and burn cultivation and sometimes raise livestock. So their village may move around following resource availability, but they always stay within the Mikia forest, which they communally own. For Vezu people, they're fishermen and fisherwomen, of course, and they occupy the littoral, which is a marginal land for, as I say, for the agriculturalist people. They exploit marine resources, and they also move around seasonally, and they would just like use the sails of their pirogue or their blankets even just to make their dwellings. And they often procure agricultural and forest goods from inland through barter or exchange or trade. And while access to land along the coast is regulated by natural and contractual social ties, access to marine resources is free for them because they think like it's the sea's inexhaustible resources. So, so there are many threats to their lifeways, like the Mikia. Lifeways are threatened by forest clearing for agricultural fields, for pasture, charcoal production, and sometimes multinational mining sites. All of those activities are like encroaching the Mikia forests. For Vezu people, the main threats to their lifeways include land grabbing, and industrial fishing, and coral reef sifting, as well as bleaching due to global warming. And Mikia people are officially recognized as indigenous, while these people are still considered as a minority ethnic group. But the idea of Mikia indigeneity has been conceived by conservationists themselves. So Mikia people don't consider themselves like indigenous at all. They are just thinking like they are the impoverished part of the people, and that's why they are marginalized towards the forest. So in 2007, Madagascar ratified the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And following this ratification was the recognition of Mikia people as indigenous in accordance to the World Bank directive, operational directive, who partially funded the creation of the Mikia protected area, which means like the government will try to expand the protected area of the country, and as the World Bank is the one who is funding, partially funding the expansion of the protected area, then it was a requirement for the World Bank to recognize any indigenous people. So the government now is forcing the Mikia people to become indigenous, not the Mikia.
What we did differently, same countries. And the African government, they spent very long thinking about their position as poor and marginalized compared to the West, but no, they never thought like about the inequality within their country. This is our conclusion regarding the cases, and the Mikia, as my colleague Nado said, they've been called indigenous by the government to secure funds from development NGOs and for fund for conservation as well, but they hasn't engaged with the community and to give them opportunities or the control over the land and some autonomy. The progress that happened in the Maasai, and the Maasai they believe that the progress that happened in Kenya, in the Kenyan case, it was because of their engagement in the international indigenous people movement. In Morocco, the case was beneficial, and there was some pros and cons, and the progress it was mainly on cultural art and language, but there is not very much that happened in terms of land control and resources and water control as well. The case of, there's only one case left, see Ogoni. Then for the Ogoni, their engagement has been very difficult, and there was a lot of struggle associated with some violence, and as Leader Barry mentioned, there was some genocide there, or the violence that contributed to the Ogoni genocide. Thank you. And we look forward for your comments and your questions.
So one of the things we noticed in comparing the cases is also that a livelihood dependent on communal resources has made certain groups more vulnerable to marginalization under state policies that were formed during colonialism that prioritize private land and private resource ownership. What else do we notice? An increased focus on legality that doesn't always yield good results. We'd love to hear what people think.
Yes, please go ahead.
A question I have, I guess a really simple question is, what would you say are the big differences between being indigenous and being First People, and can they be used interchangeably?
In Africa, no. In Africa, some groups are both, but many groups have identified as indigenous without being First People. The Maasai have been in Tanzania for less time than my ancestors have been in Canada. But because of that tenure system that's dependent on commonly managed pasture, and because of the colonial legacies of policies that prioritize private land ownership, that has made the Maasai very vulnerable to land appropriation and placed them in a similar social political position as indigenous groups here in North America. So one of our conclusions is that it's really important that we move away in Africa in general from a focus on First Peoples to understanding those structural processes that marginalize some groups more than others. Yeah.
I hear that the indigenous people don't have education, they don't have higher education. A lot of times when we think of education, we think of the Western education as the only education, when in fact that's not the only education we have. Have you observed any kind of education, be it informal, non-formal, or verbal education among the indigenous people?
Bledibari, in the Ogoni case, is there effort to educate outside of sort of Western thinking?
I'm not sure how to answer that question best. It's a great question, I'm just not sure how to answer it best. So, the Ogoni, like most of the parts of Nigeria, they follow the system in that, and those are other types of ways of knowing.
Yeah, actually, to answer also the question, it's education is there because we have what we call like social memory, and we have also what we call traditional ecological knowledge, and those knowledge are like transferred like from generation to generation, either through song, either through rituals, or even like around the hearth, where during the night, like when people are telling all those legends and stories, through storytelling, even through the way you wear, the way you, everything, because it's not only like going to school, to a class, that's where you learn, but in a traditional society, you learn by observing, you learn by listening to people talking, so definitely there is a teaching going on, but it's not the Western way of educating people.
Yeah, Nadir, so you talked about education and the informal education. It exists there. Guided education exists there, but it doesn't have the same structure as in the West. Then, as my colleague Nadu mentioned, the traditional ecological knowledge, because that's partly like my background, and I've worked with some herbalists and some people who practice the traditional medicine, and I've seen that knowledge being transferred from parent to their kids, and let's say, for example, a father will take 2 or 4 of his kid and teach them about plants used for medicine. Then there is a teaching, there is a knowledge that's being documented and transferred orally, but probably not in the same structure and the same context you might think of as in the West.
I wanted to ask about pastoralism in the Maasai of Kenya. So you mentioned that like cattle ranching has taken over much of the land and encroached on their traditional lifestyle. So what is Kenya doing that? Is it like buying off land that is now reserved for the Maasai, or what's the way forward? Are they buying the Maasai cattle ranches, or is it like they're going to end up abandoning pastoralism altogether?
Yeah, in the 1990s, the group ranch system was kind of, they got rid of it, and it's recently been, there's new policy to individually assign land to members of the Maasai community, and so within the past 2 decades, I'd say that many Maasai communities or individuals in the community have applied to grants of land, and actually in 2020 there were a few successful claims to land, so it's moved away from the community group ranch style.
The problem with the group ranching was that each person owned a small piece of a group ranch, and then if somebody had financial difficulties, they would sell part of that land. And so it was meant to stick the Maasai into this private land ownership scheme, but it really just led to more loss of land.
Okay, I'll go first.
Maria.
I think there are not a lot of people interacting with indigenous communities, and you have that opportunity to do that. I'm wondering whether in your work you are engaging in helping these communities keep a record, because I think one of the biggest tragedies of the African continent is the fact that we have zero record of what our past was, not because it didn't exist, but because no one kept those records. And I think increasingly, no one still is keeping a record other than the winner tells the history, and so it's the leaders who are. But you have very little stake in it, in the sense that your job there is to explore, interact with this community well, as you grow in your knowledge and understanding of them. But are you doing that? Is there something like that going on in those communities? Because I find what you're saying really especially about the Tigoni, and yet that's, all you see is the pollution and all that. But I find it really interesting and realizing that there is very little out in the mainstream about these communities, and it will be lost ultimately. So are you doing any of that? Or is there anything going on like that?
This is a question very much for Nato to answer.
Yeah, actually that's why I have prepared state.
Okay.
I'm working on oral history from southwestern Madagascar, just about those indigenous people called Vezu and Mikia. So what we basically are doing is to just recognize that knowledge is not just like from the knowledge that we learn from class, and we treat all those informants. They're not even like informants; they're historians. It's just like us, but it's in another school. So we give a voice to those people to collaborate as a peers, not as a subject. Then we have what we call a VESU, ecological knowledge exchange, which is like a collaboration between scholars from Penn State and those historians from the VESU communities. So we teach them how we work, and we are eager also to know how they work. So we accept just through such kind of collaboration now, then we have what we call knowledge co-production. So we co-produce knowledge, which is very, very rich, I'm telling you. We have all those archives, and we are still like working on it, how we can like disseminate it, because some of them are not really supposed to be, exposed to the public, and some of them are maybe like, it's okay to let people know. But just through such kind of collaboration, that's how you can really build trust between educated people, which they think like Western people as well, and those local people. So in such that kind of way of producing knowledge, that's when you start to dig on what was going on in the past. And they do have a record. It's not like how we record knowledge in a book and in the web, but they do have a way of recording storing that knowledge. But the problem is like just due to what we call development now in progress, it's a kind of like disrupting that the transfer of that knowledge to the next generation, and it's very scary to see it, like, because the new generations are tempted to follow what they call development, but they don't want to listen to the elders anymore. So that's the thing that is kind of like scary, because once you remove that knowledge from there, which is like, that knowledge is the one that kept them like really resilient to all the challenges they face in environmental or socio-political, then they panic, like they don't know where to go if you remove that essence in the society.
And I have to say, for this project, how lucky are we that we have 3 African Indigenous scholars working with us. Susan Kuchikut is Maasai, and then others who have in-depth time with other communities. And then we're all at Penn State and able to sit and talk to each other. It's been just really exciting.
Dr. Kimani, who will be giving a speech. Just a brief introduction. Dr. Mufi Kimani is an applied economist focused on development policy, her work is concentrated on South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa in the areas of education, labor, agriculture, environment, and health. And she is a visiting assistant professor in the Penn State School of International Affairs. Please help me welcome Dr. Mufi Kimani.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to keep my mask on. all for your help because I have a really bad cold. My understanding is it's really a really bad cold. Because I'm not the only one who has it. My daughter's cold seems to be a habit. So she brought it home and it's been a week. And I'm still down on it. So nonetheless, we can continue. So if I have to stop and cough, don't mind me. So when I had a conversation, first of all, thank you very much for the introduction and for having me. So when Sandra asked me to have this, to be a guest speaker, I wasn't sure how I would fit in, given the theme that they have. But I realized in a lot of ways, my work, which has been on education, has a pivotal point or place in the whole conversation about development initiatives, because education is one agenda that is actually going to stay in terms of, let's see this one, yes, in terms of going forward. So before I go there, so first I'm actually going to try and marry the present, the continuous present, and the future, demographic dividend, and how we get there, and how we interact with it as a continent moves forward. And obviously being in the global space of the idea, the fact that technology is becoming the one thing you can't do without, and yet it is the one thing that is really far out of reach for most Africans. So my talk, therefore, is really going to be about, okay, there we go. So first, I'd like to briefly just go through an overview of where the continent is in terms of economic development, and then get to engage with the issues of education, particularly look at what the levels of attainment are, the quality, which obviously is a big deal. It doesn't matter how high the attainment is if the quality isn't matching up, and the skill mismatch, which heavily relies on what comes out of the education system and what the market needs, and then gets to the demographic dividend. And I should ask, is there a demographer in the room? Oh, that's a treasure. I'm not an expert, but there's some work we've done in South Africa on 5 countries on the continent, pretty much covering the entire continent on demographic dividends, and that's heavily where I'm going to lean on in that. And getting to engage with the issues around what demographic dividend is all about. Dependency ratio is something the continent still interacts with, not just the continent, but even elsewhere, but it's really different on the continent given the issues of education, of employment and the age differences that there exist. And then finally get to look at the demographic window of opportunity, just what it really means. And so first, as I say, just a brief, with a laser focus as to what's really interesting in my talk. Which first, overall, obviously, Africa has been really in the good side of economic development. A lot has happened. Caveat being, obviously, it's relative, because if you're so far at the bottom, having a 7% growth is really not that big. Because if you're coming, for instance, you think about countries like Ethiopia, which were really, really poor, and now you talk about having 7, 8, or 6 to 7, or even more percent growth, then it's really that relative that is always blocking the conversation. Nonetheless, there has been a huge fortune growth in the continent, beginning the 2000s. So you have the commodity boom, obviously, it's ongoing, given, especially now, with the need for batteries and electrifying our cars, that commodity boom is bound to continue. And there has been a rapid and sustained economic growth across the different sectors. And with all that has happened globally, Africa has one way or another survived the global financial crisis without too much capital. Thank you so much. And then, thank you. And then, most recently and ongoing, survived the COVID scenario. Everyone is constantly asking, how comes? How did they? And obviously at the beginning, the worry was, Africa will get slaughtered by COVID, but that didn't happen. So getting to appreciate all that and appreciating the fact that, yes, the continent is generally positive. We don't get to hear a lot of that, but that's what's going on. And when obviously on the ground is a lot of positive, and not to forget that it's relative. But then when you think about the growth, It has happened across different sectors, but the biggest sector that has really seen the growth has been the service sector, which is getting, I would say, growing in a lot of ways. Insurance is becoming a big thing. In the past, obviously, people would invest in their family. The bigger the family size, the more insured you will be. But now that awareness of, oh, let's get house cover is increasing. And so some of these, yes, reality on the ground, benefit on the ground, which is good. And then agriculture is still big, and manufacturing, obviously, sluggish. And that's going to be unlikely to get bigger unless the continent owners do something. China is not going to let the manufacturing bit go. So that's a big deal in terms of you think about the future, because at the moment, manufacturing is pretty much sort of, I would say, in a plateau, mainly because exports won't happen, and so you have a lot of import from China and elsewhere. And then you have industry, and industry is diverse when you think about what's going on because of what it covers. So all these sectors have been good, and all this economic growth has been valuable and need more of it. But the problem has been the fact that employment has barely grown. Unemployment, if anything, is perverse across the continent. At least in South Africa, when you think of the way definitions really are done, typically you will hear about unemployment that fits the discussion. Unemployment level that fits the discussion, which is usually the narrow unemployment. Now when you think of the real unemployment, it is the broad unemployment, which is usually to the 50%, you know. But what we get to hear is this narrow definition of unemployment. And so unemployment is a big problem, ongoing. And obviously, these unemployment levels depend obviously on the economic growth, but most importantly on education level. Unfortunately, education levels still are very low. We look at the numbers in a bit. So my thought is, I think you complain already. So first, I think, because as I've said, now education is an important element of, I think, one of the things that Africa still needs to work on is education. And it has remained low. And so I thought my conversation about this will start from education, getting to navigate towards the job market, and then getting to see the population growth. How can Africa really try to harness that potential going forward? And so the education sector has a lot of challenges. And one of the most, I think, common challenge across the sectors is education quality. It is low, and not just at the low levels, but you know, across the different levels. For South Africa, the education quality is really bad at the low level, and then when you get to secondary education, it's really selective. You still have this bimodal system where you have the formerly white schools have top-notch, you know, education, and then you go to the tertiary level. It is top-notch, but then who gets there? How many of, you know, African, or what we call in South Africa, Black South Africans, because Black in South Africa encompasses the colors, the Indians, you know, the mixed race. They're all considered as Black. Very few of them, yet they're the majority, really get to that top because they don't have access to quality. So quality is a big deal. And obviously on the continent, it varies. I've just given an example of what it is like in South Africa. When you think of countries like Rwanda, it's small, it's getting there, but it's very controlled. If you think about Ghana, it's different. We all have very different education systems, and how we actually assess is all different. And now, obviously, this quality is not just about the children, but it's also about the educators themselves. Now, for South Africa, to use that, because that's what I really know very well, the fact that the historically disadvantaged population was given low quality education in terms of even the teachers themselves. Like, you would have, if you're a Black person, going to get an education to be an instructor or a teacher, you don't get the same quality. That has consequences in terms of how you teach, what you teach, and how you do it. So that quality is also instructors. So the quality isn't good on that level. And then we talk about resources. providing resources is good and needed, but how the resources are used is a whole different ballgame. And then, now these issues, obviously, the quality issues affect the levels, because if you are not getting well educated, your progression across the different levels is compromised. And so you have low levels of attainment as a consequence, obviously, of many factors. But one of the factors is the fact that you have low quality, grade repetition, and frustration of children. So you end up really dropping out. Obviously, the Millennium Development Goals made a huge difference in the sense that a lot of countries signed up to make sure that to compulsory education, which meant that at least you have a huge population that, by design of the systems, have had at least a primary level education. Going beyond that, very few do. And going forward, that's consequential, because those basic skills are needed, but not what the future is asking for. So we need to go beyond saying that we have this compulsory basic education. How about getting people to have skills? But so low levels of attainment still persist, and so you have majority still, in terms of the data, have primary or no education. And then now you talk about all these education issues we have, then what about the system itself? Is it really marrying with the market? And so you have the issues of skill mismatch, where you're having an education that is very theoretical, and then you get out of the market, the schooling system, and you have a market that wants to have hands-on skills. So that's a mismatch. And so, or not just even just that theoretical mismatch, but the fact that you are training for courses that no longer have a place in the job market. So that skill mismatch is a problem. Now, just to give some data on what this has been, now you can see from these low reading proficiency is a problem, not just in the African continent, but elsewhere. As you can see, low-income countries, obviously Africa falls into that category. And when you look at Africa itself, you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it has low reading proficiency. And actually, there are a couple of international assessment programs, and from one of them, in 2014, 58% of grade 6 students in West and Central Africa could not read proficiency. That's significant, that's huge. So you can imagine, grade 6 students, they can't read. Most African countries, you no longer require kids to pass a grade. And even if it's pass, it's some sort of, the only one. So you're carrying forward students who can't read, they move on. Anyway, it's not as bad in the East, but it's still bad. 37% not having that proficiency. And so it's not just in reading, but it's also in quantitative mathematics. So as you can see, it is a big problem, and a huge numbers from the graph on the other end. Most countries, not most countries, but a good number of countries you have as high as almost 80, like Niger, Chad, in terms of mathematics. Those are big numbers, proportions in terms of not being able to do the grade level required kind of quantitative mathematics. Now, these problems are also an indicator of the systems themselves, in terms of the education systems. And in this case, you look at the global world average, then in terms of quality systems, and you can see clearly most countries are way from the average. That line indicating the average. Kenya, Rwanda, Mauritius, Cote d'Ivoire, and Zambia, and Ghana and Lesotho are just on the line. Clearly, South Africa is right near at the end there. It's very low. And it's not because South Africa doesn't have the money to actually spend a lot of money. It is not that these countries are not putting resources in it. It is a structural system that it has a lot of faults in it and needs mending. But how do you change a system that, to some extent, for example, in South Africa, it is, to a large extent, and I use this word in quotes, captured by unions. Unions are good. I'm actually an advocate of union. My students probably know that, those who are in here. So, but in South Africa, for example, unionization in the education system is fundamentally the feeder system to the political system. The current president was a union leader at one time. And not just anywhere, but So the point I want to make here is that the education system has issues, and these issues are fundamental and need to be addressed, not just with resources, but a lot more needs to go in, and that's where you could come into place in that. Now, education attainment again has changed. It's getting better, but it hasn't really gotten where we need it to be. The pyramid is still too, at the top. A very small proportion is getting there. So when you think of the attainment, what do we really desire? What we desire in terms of having a good or an ideal education attainment is what we would say you have a huge chunk of the population, at least the majority, have completed secondary education, and at least they have some fundamental, foundational skills. Let it be carpentry, let it be masonry, let it be something more than just saying you have these basic, primary education. So when you talk about an ideal structure, that's what you want to get, because not everyone will be an academic at some point. So in terms of, this is an overall, in terms of when you think of the African continent in general, what the land is like, and that was the 2010 data, it is old. And so you think about what is it like currently, and when you think about these people who have at least gotten some education, are they getting somewhere? Are they getting some jobs? And so in this, the first graph here, you can see that the formal qualification in terms of people who are in the working, or what we consider in economics or in development, maybe even I think in sociology, the working age population, which is very important in terms of not just the job market, but also in terms of development issues. Now, you can see that when you look at the first one, a lot of them, like you look at Namibia, Mauritius, have a primary education. So majority of the people who have these formal qualifications have primary, and as you see all the way to Senegal, the numbers get smaller. And when you look at the graph on the end, clearly that graph from the past, you come to the present, it hasn't changed much. Look at the tertiary, it is still really minute. At least the South African data, you will have 5% get to university. Now, that 5% takes an average of finishing a first degree, 5 to 7 years. Now, that's a lot of resource wastage, but at the same time, some of them you can drop out. So entering into university is not necessarily completion, and that completion is expensive. It's costing a lot of resources. So what can we do about it? So clearly, educational attainment has a long way to go in terms of, achieving, getting the continent to go where we need it to be. Clearly, if you compare the two different groups that are compared in the other graph, the young and the old, there is hope. There are more young people attaining more or higher levels of education. So tomorrow doesn't look so bad. Now to look at these, you think, where are these working people, the population that has formal qualification, where are they and what are they doing? And what does the market really need in terms of getting these economies to grow? Now, first, obviously, tertiary enrollment is not meeting the needs of the market because the traditional, courses is still what a lot of students are pursuing. And why is it that? Because a lot of universities still offer the same courses that they offered in memorial. There is very little change because a lot of this change needs you to go back and change it. But I know when you go back home, you meet a lot of needs, people don't want to change, and often at times you think, you come with a mentality, they'll be like, you think you know better, right? So, but we need that to happen. We need, I would say, sort of wear a coat rather than develop a tough skin, or to be able to survive those environments. But clearly, changes need to happen because, as you can see, when we think about the future, technology is really at the center of it. Yet, if you look at this graph, in terms of enrollments, you have a very small proportion of African students enrolling into science, health, and ICT. That's 10% lower than the median income countries elsewhere. So that's really significant because how are we going to meet tomorrow's post-industrial revolution that is coming if we don't get these skills? And clearly, we are under, utilizing the human capital resources that we have. Statistics show that at the moment, only 55% of African human capital potential is being captured. 55%, that's like 45, wake up in the morning, chill out, the sun is good. That shouldn't be happening. Because I think, to a very large extent, a lot of these or young people on the continent, that it's not that they don't want to work, but there are no opportunities to do that. And so the employment distribution by skill, you can see clearly there is a huge gap in terms of the skills that are being used. Across the country, South Africa is the best one, and Mauritius is coming next. Obviously, the southern region, they have more capacity to absorb high skills, and South Africa actually runs a program because internally it hasn't been able to generate enough high-skilled people, and so what they have is these critical skill visa programs where a lot of highly qualified African, and say a lot of, because you have European and Americans too, but a lot of Africans get these high-skilled jobs. So you see, that absorption is obviously that element of brain drain coming from elsewhere. But still, there's potential to grow all these, to provide opportunities for these high skills. But at the moment, the bulk of the skills that are being used is medium skills. So that skill mismatch is ongoing. And so it is a problem because a lot of businesses are not able to operate as efficiently or in their full capacity as they would because of lack of skilled workforce. In Tanzania, it's 41%, and Nigeria, 6%. And you can imagine the capacity, the potential that Nigeria, for instance, has in that regard. And then you have, obviously, the one thing that is clear to all of us is the fact that IT, digital technology is becoming the one thing we all need. And so we need that skills set, and it is actually in demand on the continent. So you have these skills, you're likely to get, at least I know in Kenya, that's a big deal. So you have these qualifications, you go back home, you're bound to get a good job. And then the biggest professions that are trending in terms of using these ICT skills, you have creative industry, food technology, 3D, I have 3D a lot. Yes, it is a reality, and I think if you think about the potential for Africa to achieve what the Asian tigers have, that leapfrogging mechanism will need this kind of technologies where you don't have to set up a whole business infrastructure or a whole, physical building to produce. So probably 3D and those kind of technologies are what is going to help Africa in terms of, progressing. And for example, even just thinking about M-Pesa in Kenya, it's coming to fruition, and I was a young, let's not get about my age, but still, I just remember the first time that M-Pesa became, you had to use it. And now, you don't even blink about it, but there was this, are you sure, is my money safe? No. But now it's become the thing, like you go to supermarkets in Kenya, your phone, you don't need a card. You don't need, it's just your phone. And so, and not just that, my grandmother who lives in rural Kenya uses that M-Pesa. She doesn't need, she calls you to say, you know how grannies are. And so, the message is M-Pesa me. And it's that small and simple. So, my point being here, probably these are the things we should think about engaging in. How can I implement my new thing I discovered in Penn State to help my local community? Because I think to a very large extent, when you think about the education we get and where we will use it, we don't envision ourselves going back home to a rural village to do something from there. We think, if I go back to Ghana, I'm going to Accra. If I think I'm going back to Nairobi, I don't think about how, yes, those are opportunities that you could go there and realize that you could make a huge difference and not spend so much because the costs of being home are usually way lower. That just, I think there are potentials in that. So what can we do about these skill mismatch issues? One thing we could do, obviously, is to invest in a skill base in terms of growing more helping more people understand what computer is all about, computing is all about. Coding isn't computing. I think my appreciation of it is totally different, but I think for people who don't have the basic computer science knowledge, do not necessarily need it to learn to code for things elsewhere in terms of what I understand. So your ability to translate the skills you have developed from here back home, there is potential in that, and in masters. So, but still, there is need to invest in that skill base, and obviously leveraging the strengths that are back on the continent. And I think most importantly, which is what I have alluded to earlier, there is need to design future-ready curriculums. Curriculum that is not just thinking of what, as the lecturers back home, I've used the notes from, the first time I taught, why do I need to change this, But, designing curriculum that meet the day, and obviously being able to do this, I know STEM is a big deal, and I think the main reason it's a big deal is the technology aspect of it. But at the same time, I think it's possible to marry this into agriculture, and it's happening. But just designing this future-ready curriculum is a necessary part of what needs to happen. Now, where are the different countries in terms of their ability, to move and meet these challenges at the same time and be able to adapt to what is prevailing? Now, if you think about the idea of leapfrogging, that cannot happen overnight. There has to be some platform that they can. So this is where we talk about, the diversification in terms of an economy, how versatile is it or not, and then obviously the complexity of the skills that people have in every country. So in a lot of countries, it's really basic, but this graph pretty much shows countries that are able to leverage the skills that they have at the moment and being able to adjust and adapt to new, so overnight kind of situations. And you can see Kenya is at the top there, and I think there has been a technological issue going on in Kenya that has been probably the reason why. Botswana, Senegal, South Africa, and Namibia. Those are the ones that at least come to the average exposure of about 0.44, which means those countries potentially could do it. But all the others could. So what do we do about getting them to build capacity at the same time bring this exposure? In a lot of ways, this exposure needs transmission from the known people who already have the skills to get to expose to bring the skills back to the continent. Now, all these things, what is the future of jobs? You think about it in terms of, but mainly when I talk about this, it's about, in a lot of ways, the fourth industrial revolution that is coming. And when you think about where Africa needs to go, we can't, as we were saying, the keynote speaker was saying earlier, we can't be copy-pasting. At some point we need to see this is what they have done, but they're here. So how do we get from here to just jump to that? And so we think about this, our ability to be able to adapt and adjust to circumstances in a way that will help. So what do we do? Obviously the first step is, what do we have? What are we working with? And be able to leverage those existing strengths to grow, to adjust to the new, different industries. And obviously mobile phone technology and all that has made a huge difference. For a lot of countries, you no longer have to plant poles, connect lines. But now banking is at your hand. But what more can we do? What skills, jobs can we potentially create for the village fishmonger? Or can we do that? They don't have to change their fishmonger businesses. Can we introduce elements that have the modern aspect to them? And then obviously, demand for specialist skills, that's increasingly a big deal in terms of specialization. People getting to do one thing and one thing, and that obviously makes you an expert, and that needs to be encouraged. And then you have development of new business models on the basis of obviously the fourth industrial revolution, and then investing in soft infrastructure. Childcare has always been communal. Can we formalize these settings and make them real jobs? And structures. Not to say that I don't appreciate it, because I couldn't give you the money, childcare needs. So I totally think that doesn't have to take the color and the designs and everything of the West, but we could tailor it to our own version of what that, that kind of infrastructure could be like. And then there's the element of transitioning from ecologically sustainable economic models. Yes, climate change is here and yes, we didn't cause it, but that doesn't mean it won't affect us. So what can we do to mitigate it in different ways in terms of, and still develop? And online platforms being a big deal. So all these future jobs are important in places, but they are largely being driven by different aspects. And from that, the list of the drivers, at least 70% of them have something to do with technology, ICT, digital world, and the Internet of Things, and 3D printing again, see? So all these mean that we need to look ahead as a continent when we envision, if you're going back home and do you wanna fit into what was already existing, or can you really bring in some new changes that has something to do with the drivers because they're inevitable to make a change. And so this has implications because what it means then, the structural transformations have to happen from that low productivity, that when you think about the food production system where we have, peasant farmers, small, is there a system that Africans or communities could agree to say, yes, it's not selling our land, but it is also owning it, but also producing in a way that is more productive or high productivity, because that's what is needed. But then obviously that calls for higher skills. Now also the implication is that there is need to create huge, there's massive job creation processes that need to happen. Now this is with the caveat of the fact that a lot of African economies have been unable to do this. South Africa, being as big as it is, has completely failed in this aspect of creating jobs. Even in the good times, this has been a problem. So now the population is predicted to grow. The population on the African continent, at least from the projected numbers we had, it's expected to grow by 1.3 billion by 2063. That's the increase that we expect to see from what we have. Now, this has implications. What kind of demographic are we going to have? Are they all going to be children? Obviously, what we want is that working age population, because that is the productive part of the society. And so, thinking about the population and the dynamics around it, clearly, the bulk of this population is still under 15. Now, the important part when you think about economic, can I press this? No, doesn't work, sorry. I can't highlight. So what we want is a 15 to 54 year old group. We want that to be the big group because that's the productive part of society. And as you can see, Africa is really a young continent. 60% of the population is under the age of 25. These are what we call dependents. Now, when you think about where on the continent are these, or where is the population growing, the Central Africa has, in terms of, when I go back here, when I talk about the working population, which is really, when you think about development, they are the ones that will be developing the continent because they're the ones going out working and that kind of a thing. So where is the bulk of this population? Now, Central Republic is leading West Africa, and all the way to North Africa being at the bottom. Now, those are geographically, demographically the numbers we have in terms of the working age population. But then you think about the relevance of this group, they are the productive. Now, we want this group to be productive. And so that's what the graph is showing us clearly, that actually, the more in countries or regions where we have this high working population, the productive part being the biggest, it's still the lowest in terms of development. And so you look at that, you see North Africa, South Africa, and the economic development, there is that inverse relationship. And that's not very encouraging. So there is need to think about these populations and think about what can we do to make sure that when, as this population is growing, we are able to reap the benefit as a continent in terms of our development. Now, and that's how we get into the three definitional terms that demographers will talk about. I'm not ratio. Clearly, one of the biggest things we can see from here is the fact that the under 15 is huge, and we have obviously the over 55 or 65 there. Those are people who need help. So they are dependent. They don't necessarily need help in terms of physical, but they need support in terms of their consumption and that kind of a thing. So if you have very high population in the under 15 and the over 54, then that's a big deal because they are consumers rather than producers. So, and clearly, so that dependency ratio is important. So you want it to be smaller because the larger the dependence that you have, the higher the smaller the ratio. So you want to have a dependency ratio that is supported in terms of more people working and fewer people not working. And so, and then you have the demographic dividend, which is pretty much everything to do with about fertility rate. The fertility rate of Africa has declined. I think the last year's statistics were 4.5. That's huge. You know, it has never happened like that big decrease. So you want the population growth to decrease, yes, and also you want fewer people to die. So that reduction will yield you the demographic dividend because it means you have fewer dependents and you're not bringing more people. So pretty much saying that under 15 is shrinking, and that's what we want to be able to reap demographic dividends. Now, what this means, therefore, is if we can achieve that demographic dividend, then we are able to get to the demographic window of opportunity, which is literally the transitional period where we say Africa is at a point where it is productive because majority of its population is the working age population, and therefore it's able to develop because it has a lot of people on deck working. Now, all these are just for you to get a feel of what the definitions are, but what's the data like? Clearly, dependency ratio on the continent has been declining relative to the rest of the world. You can see Europe is going up, and Asia, similarly, not as much, and Latin America, but clearly for Africa, the blue line, it is declining. That's good news in terms of the future. It's not like we don't want more Africans, it's just that we want to be able to sustainably develop at the same time. Now, when I talk about the window of opportunity here, I described it, but when do we have this window? When does this window open in terms of the future? So this is a window that it will only happen when we have the underage group falls to below 30%, and the old population, which is over 65, is below 15. So that, when that happens across or on average, then you're getting into that window. And it only lasts 3 to 4 decades. Why does it last 3 to 4 decades? That adjustment period is really dependent on fertility rate. You know, the quicker the fertility rate. And as I said, it has really come down. That means we'll get there sooner. But that has implications because if you get there sooner, then what it implies is that you'll get out of that window quicker. Because as we know, the moment people realize, oh, we have shrunk as a population, our animal instinct is we need to reproduce. So that's what happens. So when will this happen to the continent? Now we did run some analysis just to get out an idea, using projections, simulations to see when. And so on average, potentially the African continent will be in reaping this, in this window. We're getting to the demographic dividend around, or having that window on average 2050, and that's a long while from now. That's not to say some countries haven't gotten there yet. And it varies because North Africa, 2050, for East and Southern Africa, those are the times. And then obviously you have those that have already gotten into this window, and you have Mauritius. Please let me know. Am I up? I'm good. So for Mauritius, it opened in 1990. Seychelles and Tunisia and South Africa in 2012. So a lot of countries are already getting these benefits. Now, overall, when you think about that window, you can see it's staggered. North America, on average, gets in there first, and then you have East Africa, Southern Africa, and then West Africa gets in last. And then when you look at it in terms of those regions, you have Tunisia being ahead of, in North Africa. In East Africa you have Seychelles, and then you have Central Africa, you have Gabon, and Southern Africa, Mauritius, and West Africa, you have Cape Verde. Now, this, obviously, as I say, the period takes time. And arriving first doesn't mean you leave first. It all also depends on that fertility rate, what's going on there. Now, just in terms of generally what is going on, you can see clearly some countries from that data have already been experiencing the benefits of having gotten into the demographic dividend, that window. But now, what is important in terms of this conversation, not just getting in, but what really gets us there? And it turns out that actually human capital development is most important. So education comes in here again. So we need more people educated. And not just, sometimes, as much as I say, we need to go beyond primary education. Statistics show that actually countries that have, on average, at least a primary education, are getting, a primary education plus more are actually getting that into the benefits of demographic dividend. So we need to get more people to go beyond primary. So having that compulsory, conversation around what can we do to encourage more people to go beyond primary education, and I think it's to have more education is important. So education is a cornerstone in terms of when you think about African potential to grow. And so realizing this dividend obviously need us to expand our investment in education, empowerment and education. And I mean empowerment as thinking of education, formal education is good, but also can we give them hands-on skills in terms of, for them to exploit existing opportunities. And obviously achieving that age structure is necessary. So we need to have the bulk of the population in that bracket of the working age population. And then obviously identify key sectors that really meet the moment. And encourage those sectors, empower them and grow them to create jobs. And without a doubt, building a supply of skilled labor force. And then promoting pro-growth economic policies, because those pretty much tie together. And finally, building an infrastructure that is needed to increase economic activity in these countries. Now, I think when I talked about all these, and when I was thinking about her request for me to be here, I tried to have a conversation with her about, so how would all this be relevant? But I realized actually, in a lot of, when we think about, because I worked in policy, in the making policy environment, and in a lot of ways, to some extent, there's always these macro level policies. And I think for Panapa and your theme, the need for those small, low-hanging fruit activities is what you could do potentially. When you think about medicine in the continent, in a lot of ways, and not just in the continent, even missionaries who go back to the continent, holding those camps, when they probably are offering just eye treatment, or those kind. So here being the fact that there are a lot of low-hanging fruits on the continent that Panapa, as a community, could engage in. In a lot of ways, on the continent, people don't have books to read. Can you gather these books? Find ways to supply those rural communities. Can you coordinate in the summer to think of how can we teach kids to code? You introduce that, you spark something in them, you do something. Because I think, to a very large extent, being Panapa, you can do more if you actually offer your skill set that you have and those things that you're able to do at your level and shine through them and build a following that could potentially help you do more in terms of the community initiatives that you are engaging in on the ground. And that, I would say, that must be my last slide. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kimani, for this amazing talk. So we can take one or two questions. Wow, it's already coming up. Okay, so we'll take two, and then the next session is happening here, so please remain, because it will be a panel with Dr. Kimani, the guest speaker, and Dr. Yewa, our keynote speaker, as well as our advisor moderating that panel. So I will let Timmy go first.
Thank you, Dr. Kimani, for your session. I would say it's really enlightening, and looking at the different language education and technological adoption. Something that keeps coming to my mind, looking at the structure of different African societies, and you mentioned again the fact that we don't have so many industries, even the very percentage of those who actually do have the skills to match, do not have opportunities to get employed. So it keeps me thinking about technical vocational skills. And looking at the large percentage of people that are non-educated, and maybe as someone involved in this, in what way does this play out? Looking at some of your recommendations, I don't see that bringing out so loud. So I just wanted to know your thoughts about it.
Yes, and I think the running education, or they call it TVET, the technical vocational education training, and I think a lot of African countries need to adapt that. I would say in Kenya, there has been a change in mindset in terms of just getting a university degree and now being, can we make TVET platforms as desirable? Because I think it's a mindset situation where you have the idea that I go for graduation for myself at the university is such a big deal. Like a lot of parents don't look at TVET the same way they perceive university. And I think that needs to, and to a large extent, I think, if I think of the grassroots environment where there has been knowledge on how to, for example, dry vegetables in an educational system that was local and hasn't been exploited. So when I think of these technological changes and someone coming from all this knowledge of how to do it and market it elsewhere, those are opportunities that potentially could be taken. And yes, there is a lot of need for those hands-on skills because the economic level in a lot of countries is not able to absorb all these university graduates. But if you have the skills, you can employ yourself, you can, from a TVET, which because actually get hands-on skills, and that's what we probably make encourage most.
PhD student in the Geography Department. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations and all these insightful thoughts. It's given us much to think about. So my question pertains to agricultural development. So both of you as speakers have referenced the need to boost productivity. And I'm very curious about your thoughts on the agricultural development models that could be best for the future of Africa, as diverse as that continent is, and what you think about these, you know, Bill and Melinda Gates steered models of, you know, the Alliance for the Green Revolution of Africa type of models of agricultural development that are very based on productivity, as opposed to maybe the resilience of local agroecology that is maybe not as productive, but perhaps more resilient to climate change as an alternative model. And I'm just very curious about your thoughts on these different models of agricultural development and the most appropriate metrics of success.
I'm going to start from you.
Yeah, you go first. That's it.
Okay, so it's I think a number of different models have been used, and you did talk about the Bill and Melinda Gates one, which is being championed by AGRA. One of the issues is, for me, it is not an either or. It's not one or the other, but also think about it as a continuum and where each of them will fit into it. I think if we go back to the basics, one, we need to increase production both in quality and in quantity. There's a large number of people to feed. I was talking about we're already struggling to provide 3 billion meals a day, and we are expected to provide 6 billion in just a matter of about 13 years. So we need to find the way to be able to produce food in large quantities. Africa at the moment, one of the key constraints is productivity. That's the yield gap, right? The yield gap in between Africa and Asia is about 4 times, right? So there is still that need for that productivity, and I believe that that model is essentially looking at how do we make the most or get maximized yields. And I also talked about that land constraint. much of the production is now through area expansion, and the land is getting scarce. So we need to be able to get more out of that land. So there's an element of that needs to take place. But again, I also recognize the environmental aspect of it. That how can we do this a little bit more sustainably, right? At this moment, the agroecological one is unable to generate the food in that large quantities that we need it. But how do we bring that balance? So that is the point where, and I think there is a continuum, right? There is a continuum. We could think of it as, at this point, we are more concerned about the quantity, but to the extent that we are able to, we also need to think about the quality component of it. So that could be part of the continuum that we look. And then, if you also look at the African part, we also talk about the whole model of smallholder against large farms. Which one do we support? Do we support large farms or support small farms? And there's been a lot of debate going on. But we also need to go back to think about, why are we even thinking about small versus large? Right. The idea of supporting smallholder agriculture is a large number of people are able to benefit, and through that, you're able to generate broad-based agricultural productivity growth, which can help generate bigger multiplier effects in income as well as in employment. Right. There are still some studies trying to find out whether medium-scale farms, which is growing really fast in the continent, are generating some of those multiplier effects. Some of the work that myself and my colleagues have done indicates that there is some multiplier effects, not necessarily even if you're thinking about employment, but where you have small medium-scale farms, they have spillover benefits on smallholder farmers. One, you have tractor service that becomes available to smallholder farmers in those areas. They are also able to crowd in buyers, aggregators, who come and also buy from smallholder farmers. Right. So there's some benefit. So it is not an either-or. I think the model that Africa may end up going is going to be a dual model, where you have the smallholder farmer lying alongside the large or medium-scale farmer. And then there are some synergies that we can get with those two.
My question is kind of a follow-up to her question and the conversation that was had about how there are Africans getting scholarships and coming here that now come from poorer backgrounds. What would be your recommendation to those students in terms of, or to those people here in the diaspora in terms of helping back there? Would it be starting an NGO, like you said? Would it be entrepreneurship, going back and being an entrepreneur, innovation? Would it be, God bless your soul if you want to do this, but getting into politics? No, seriously, man. If that's what you want to do. And also, because like even things can be done here to help there in the sense that remittance is one of the biggest economies for a lot of African countries, but as people stay here and then their parents die off, they're not going to be remitting as much as their parents because they don't understand why or don't have that connection. What would y'all recommend to those Africans?
So what I'm hearing in your question is, in how many ways can you go back or return or assist?
Yeah.
But you have to physically do it, be on the ground to do it. You want to start?
Well, okay, I'll go. So first, I think there is value in learning how things work here, as he said, the keynote speaker earlier on, saying get to interact with PENN State administration system. How do things work? Because there is, when you go back home, like fresh graduate, you go back with that technical knowledge, and there is more needed I think in a lot of instances, when you get a job back home, you need to be more than the technician to make a huge difference, because the technical aspect of it will earn you money. But what else can you do? Can you set up, even if you think about setting an NGO like Savannah would like to, you need that knowledge of how to. So I would say to any student who is here, can you get a bit of experience here? Interact with the world here, and then go back home, if that's what you desire to go back home to do. And going back home, in my view, is a huge opportunity profile portfolio that is waiting for you. because Africa has a lot of opportunities. And in my worldview, they are, like, I think it is possible, and I'll use this word, to become a millionaire in such a short time if money is what you want to make. Because these opportunities, there are opportunities in terms of non-existing infrastructure that you could potentially build at a very low cost, because there are all these skills. People don't have jobs. People will be happy to work with you, to learn what you're doing, to build something, to be part of that. So I think, I wouldn't say don't go back home, but I would say if you want to go back home, it is important. I mean, it is important to go with more than just the degree you got. Get some experience, build a profile for yourself, because that experience allows you to have a window into what this is a developed world. So what is it like? How does it work? If I go back home, can I do more with my knowledge, the degree that I got, and build things? So that's what I would say.
So before going physically, are there things we can do?
I think I would definitely agree with her on that. And I also want to emphasize that place is no longer a limitation to make an impact. We're just talking about Panapa. They are not traveling there, but they are trying to find other ways to be able to make an impact. And I would also say that we cannot be too prescriptive about exactly what each one will do. It depends on the strength of that individual and what they feel more comfortable doing, or what their technical training has afforded them. And like she said, this is a developed country. I don't know how much thing is left to develop. Right. But that is a developing country. Everything is developed. And there's a saying, it said, your observation is your responsibility. So everything that you see as a problem, that is your cash cow. And it's all over. And you, by virtue of your experience here, you essentially have developed a bird's eye view of things in your country. You learn more about yourself and more about your country living outside of it than you do when you are inside. So you see more of those opportunities when you return than you do when you are here. And I want to emphasize to graduate students here, it's not a crime to go home.
Yeah.
It's not. Yeah, because I see there's a lot of anxiety and panic about my visa, it's not a crime to go home, right? And we want to emphasize that, look, if someone from a first-class university here is concerned about a job, then we have a problem.
You're saying if they're concerned about seeking jobs rather
Yeah,
than creating them.
that's another creating them.
Yeah.
Then we have a problem. But I will add that in returning home, you talk about the skill set, go home with something. I think there are opportunities, but the resources to tap those opportunities flow from here. And that is why you also don't spend all your time in the lab when you are here.
Yeah.
And spend all your time just doing coursework and be able to network and meet people that you can partner with, right? You come to Panapa, you have what? You could look at a number of countries that are represented there. If you could have a situation where almost every country you know someone there, that is a business, that's a conglomerate that you are establishing right there. And that is how we need to be thinking. That it is not just about conference, it's about developing those networks and how to make an impact.